Good morning. My name is Brian Wheeler, Director of Communications for the City of Charlottesville. Welcome to Cville360, a program to inform and engage the Charlottesville community. During the coronavirus pandemic, the city's leadership knows you want to hear from us frequently about our actions. We also want to hear from you and provide opportunities for engagement. We've launched this program on our streaming sites, on Comcast Channel 10, and on a companion Zoom webinar, so you can tune in live and on demand while practicing social distancing. This webinar allows you to join the broadcast and ask questions of our guest. If you want to try the webinar, visit charlottesville.gov/Zoom for the registration information. A link to each show appears at the bottom of the page. At the top of each show, we will have a brief update on the state of the coronavirus and the city's response. And today we will hear from Deputy Fire Chief Joe Powers, who will join us via webinar. The remainder of the program today will focus on a discussion with City Councilor Lloyd Snook and City Police Chief RaShall Brackney. We had a City Council meeting last night that we want to catch up on. On the webinar, you can type in your questions in the Q&A module, and you can click the raise your hand icon, and I'll bring you onto the program directly to speak with our guest. So first, let's welcome Deputy Chief Joe Powers.
Hey, good morning, everyone.
Hey, good morning.
Thank you, Brian, for inviting me back.
Chief Powers, if you could give us an update on where we are and how the metrics are trending right now.
Sure, absolutely. Hey, everybody. My name is Joe Powers. I'm the Deputy Fire Chief of Community Risk Reduction with the Charlottesville Fire Department. I'm also the city's incident commander for the COVID-19 management team. I wanted to cover very quickly again the COVID-19 management team's 5 strategic goals, and they include preparing plan for community support, transition, and recovery, sustain the healthcare system by flattening that curve, protect and support our first responders and other direct care or direct service providers, and protect and support vulnerable populations, and then of course provide essential services throughout the pandemic. So as of today, and according to the Thomas Jefferson Healthcare District's COVID-19 portal, which you can also find on the charlottesville.gov/coronavirus, the numbers are showing 546 total cases across the region with 19 fatalities. That's 125 cases total in the Charlottesville city of Charlottesville, and 199 in Albemarle County. Now, that's a much bigger number than we saw last week when I reported out from the same data source. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit. But from a statewide standpoint, we continue to see a downward trend in the percentage of positive COVID-19 cases using that 7-day moving average. But here locally, we are seeing an increase in new cases. And I talked to the Thomas Jefferson Health District this morning, and they report that because of the increased testing across the region from both in these special events with these pop-up testing facilities throughout the city like we had 2 weekends ago, and especially the increase in testing with doctors' offices and other healthcare providers, we're seeing more testing, which is also going to show more cases. But from another metric in that percentage of positive cases, from a statewide standpoint, on average, we're seeing 11.8% of all cases, all testing show positive for coronavirus. But here locally, that number is only 6.2%. So we're much lower than our partners across the state. We also see an increase in COVID-19 hospitalizations, and in talking to the health district, that's attributed to UVA's additional bed capacity, and they're helping other hospitals across the region and across the state to decompress those hospitals. And from a PPE standpoint, we're showing good stock of PPE for first responders, and we're helping support those other healthcare providers throughout the community. As a reminder, the Virginia Department of Health is continuing to fill those 1,300 positions for testing and contact tracing. So if you or anybody that you know is looking for a job, that's a great job to jump on top of. From a community transition standpoint, we are still in phase one, which Governor Northam calls Safer at Home, which we began back on Friday, May 15th. The city of Charlottesville, from a phase one perspective, all of our services are available virtually and our city hall remains closed. But we are waiting for Governor Northam's press conference today to start talking about phase two. And it looks like phase two may occur as early as June 5th, which is this Friday. Now remember, phase two will increase the limits of social gatherings from 10 people to 50 people. It loosens the business restrictions, and it'll allow the city of Charlottesville to have a slow transition to in-person city services. And we'll keep an eye. Please keep an eye on the city website, because I think that Brian Wheeler will provide some really good information on there as well. And Brian, you might want to give an update also on how to sign up for those news alerts, because as we move into phase two, that might be an important concept. And lastly, when we're talking about phase three, likely we'll move out of phase one relatively quickly. We'll move into phase two, but moving into phase three may be a while. And the gateway to get into phase three is, as the governor quoted, no evidence of rebound for a sustained period of time. So we'll have to wait and see what that press conference shows today. From a regional standpoint, we continue to develop long-term plans. And when we talk about long-term, we're talking about 12 to 18 months to provide housing and food for the most vulnerable populations. And we continue to work with long-term healthcare facilities to make sure that they have the PPE and policy in place to maintain the virus and keep those populations safe. And then lastly, we continue to monitor our PPE stash, our supplies, and make sure that we have a good supply chain. And then lastly, if you can, please continue to stay at home. If you're sick, please don't go to work, and call your doctor for advice. And like always, wash those hands for 20 seconds with soap and water. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Chief Powers. And thank you for plugging the website, charlottesville.gov/coronavirus, where you can see the up to the minute or up to the day recommendations, metrics from the health district. And also, he mentioned the city alerts, and you can sign up for those at charlottesville.gov/city notes. City notes is where you can find the page that has all the releases that come from a variety of departments within the city. As we switched to a new website over the past couple months, we've enabled a lot more alerts that you can sign up for or unsubscribe to. So you can really dial it in to your preferences, and you can check that out and make sure you get those announcements. Chief Powers, I guess, the big question is, it sounds like the metrics here locally are looking better than statewide, but you think the governor today is going to make some announcement about phase two, and it sounds like the state may be ready. And then I guess it sounds like the city of Charlottesville and Albemarle County are ready as well. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, from a local standpoint, I think we're doing very well, and we're going to be keeping a close eye on what Governor Northam says today at his press conference, and that'll definitely put some plans in motion for the city. And step up our transition and recovery task force to make sure that our community has got the support that they need to move forward into phase two.
Well, that will definitely change a lot of things, and we do want the community to follow closely all the information coming from Albemarle County and the city of Charlottesville. And Deputy Chief Powers will work closely with City Manager Teron Richardson to make the final call about the posture for the city of Charlottesville. Right now, we have scheduled City Hall to be closed up through June 21st. So that Sunday right now is when we expect city staff to be remaining at home and teleworking, but that could change depending on the governor's announcement today. So it's a rapidly changing situation, and we encourage the public to watch that information carefully. Chief Powers, any final thoughts before we move on to our next guest?
No, and I'm looking forward to the remainder of the show, and I'll stay tuned to listen out.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, the balance of our show is going to be focused on two of our guests, who are Lloyd Snook, member of Charlottesville City Council, and Chief RaShall Brackney, who joins us in studio. And I'm going to bring up their pictures here, and may need some assistance with my team if I can hit the right buttons. See if I can do it. And we're going to get a wide shot here in studio with Chief Brackney in a second. There she is. It takes two of us to do a webinar and a live TV broadcast, so there are a lot of moving parts here. But we're going to start with Lloyd Snook. And let me bring it back now to the right place. Sorry, now I'm hitting the wrong buttons. It was a long night last night, so let me start there and just point out that I did an 8-hour day and then had a 6-hour council meeting. So council had one item on the action item on their agenda, but we still ended up spending 6 hours together yesterday, Lloyd.
All by Zoom.
So you can talk about that, but before we get into the meeting and the budget, I think we should talk about what's happening all around us and in the nation, and I think we should say his name, George Floyd, and
Right.
we should talk about the terrible injustice of his murder on the streets of Minneapolis. And, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on, this past weekend and the protests and demonstrations that we're seeing around us that's now a national phenomenon, and that I know people in your position and Chief Brackney as well are having to think very carefully about. So let's start there.
Let me say, first of all of us on City Council, and not just me personally, not just the mayor who made a very strong statement along with Chief Brackney, all of us were just horrified at what happened with George Floyd and how he was killed. And it has catalyzed a lot of things. It has catalyzed things in Charlottesville. It has catalyzed things, more importantly, nationwide. And one of the things that concerns us most, and frankly just scares the heck out of me, is the national response. And I don't mean just the response on the streets. I mean the response out of the White House. I'm deeply concerned that we may have a president and others involved in national government who see benefit to this political benefit to this kind of turmoil. And I'm deeply concerned about maintaining solid leadership locally, both in the citizenry and among government officials, to make sure that we don't let that kind of stuff happen here. And so I was really gratified to see over the weekend when Charlottesville had a demonstration, and I had estimated 500, others have estimated up to 1,000. I don't know how many people were there, but there were a lot of people on Market Street there, and they were protesting peacefully. There were a couple of times when for example, one time somebody was trying to get started leading a chant that I thought could have led to incitement to violence, and it was a blank that peace blank, suggesting, I thought, that perhaps this person was advocating something other than a peaceful response. And I was very glad to see that nobody joined in that chant. He tried about 3 or 4 times, nobody joined in it, and that was great. The other thing related to that, and I think it was Diana Bryant, but I'm not 100% sure, at one point made the comment, "We built this town, we're not going to burn it down." As long as Charlottesville's residents as a whole feel that sense of ownership of the town, of the city, as long as we feel that sense of commitment to it and to its well-being, we will be in good hands. And so I want to applaud the civilian leadership in particular for that. I also want to applaud the city's leadership, police force leadership in particular. I know I talked to Chief Brackney before the whole thing got started. I know that they were in a lot of consultation and a lot of preparation that they were going through to make sure that they were really well prepared to handle things, and they were. And I talked to some of the officers who were present during the demonstration, and they were at a distance. They were in the background. They were monitoring things, but they were allowing everything to go as peaceful demonstrations should go. And there was no escalation. There was no response when people would be making anti-police chants and things like that. So I was glad to see that they were well prepared and well schooled. I understand that before they went out, Captain Joe Hatter gave a talk that to the first responders who were going to be on the scene, reminding them very eloquently of what the nature of their oath is, and how important it is to not lose sight of what their oath is to serve and to protect. So kudos to the city and to the city leadership and to the police. Kudos also to the civilian leadership who organized a good, meaningful, peaceful protest.
Thank you, Mr. Snook. And, Chief Brackney, since you're here with us and we were just talking about you, your reflections on the weekend, I think, would be important.
Absolutely. This is a challenging space to sit in as a Black mom, a Black woman whose husband is African American, who has Black niece or nephews, cousins, a brother, who could find themselves on the other side or find themselves in a George Floyd or Eric Gardner or Michael Brown position. And it has always been a challenge as I attempt to balance my Black identity with the things that I fight for in terms of police reform and police cultural reform, which is even a greater challenge than a policy challenge, which everyone is always screaming for. You can have policies. It's how they're implemented and how they're received and the way in which we in the policing community take those to heart, which is really important for us. I appreciate that there is a call to reaffirm our oaths, but those are hollow words that often ring hollow to communities that are in pain right now. And what I would also say, my reflections are, these are not protests. These are not riots. These are pain that's being expressed in civil discourse. This is what we're supposed to do. We complained when Colin Kaepernick kneeled to fight against police brutality. And now we saw a different type of kneeling that took the breath out of an individual. And now there's this call to do it differently and to do it peacefully. But when there was that space to do that, it fell on deaf ears for decades and has. So I am proud of the city of Charlottesville that they did not allow someone else to describe their narrative and the voices that they have here. They did not allow people to detract from their statements. And it was powerful to see, and I'll help Councilman Snook with this. There were more than 1,000 those persons who were out there engaging in civil discourse, right? And reframing it from protests and riots also allows the officers to see the humanity in what people are doing. It also deconflicts it, right? We talk about de-escalation, and we'll talk about that a little later in the program, but how we frame what is happening out on the streets of America also allows us to respond to it in the way that we should, with humility, with humanity, and with allowing people the opportunity for their voices to be heard, and rightfully so.
Well, and something you've said since you've been here is that you made a choice to join the Charlottesville Police Department after 2017. Likewise, I decided to join the city staff after 2017. Mr. Snook and I have been longtime residents of this community, but he chose to get on city council after 2017. So it's also work we've signed up for and want to see this community do things right.
You're absolutely right. This is, I say I don't envy our mayor. I don't envy our council persons who must make those type of decisions. But you're right. The reason I am in the policing profession and have been now for 36 years is because, you know, you hear these cries to then good cops should just give up their uniforms. They should get out of the business. Well, then who do you leave here? How do you change a system? Except if you're visible and vocal and push back against establishments. And I'm on record here in this community for the last 2 years of doing that. I'm in full uniform, in my Charlottesville uniform, in Orlando, Florida, in front of President Trump, taking a knee when they decide that there should be a standing ovation for him. So my commitment to these causes and reform aren't just current keyboard activism. It's not this current one. It's part of my narrative and it's part of my DNA, and it's not new to me to do and push back against a profession, which I think is an honorable profession. But as I've said in my statements, there are a lot of blood stains on our badges.
Yep. Well, we will come back to Chief Brackney after we talk some more with Councilor Snook. And Mr. Snook, let's talk about the City Council meeting and the couple items you had on the agenda that required action.
Well, the first thing that we did was to finally fill out the Police Civilian Review Board. We had received applications for the PCRB back in January, and we had named, I think, the 7 members of the PCRB. We did not, at the time we were making those appointments, we did not have an applicant for the spot that was reserved for someone with some police experience, and so we didn't fill that spot. After that meeting, after the time when we filled the other spots, we received an application from Philip C., who many of you all may know is a former middle school teacher at Buford. In fact, he was my daughter's, I think, 7th grade civics teacher in about 2001. He also has been active with the First Tee program. He is a supervisor with Parks and Rec at this point. And he has police experience, having worked for the Appomattox County Sheriff's Department and a couple of other things. I've forgotten the rest of the resume. So he will fill out the PCRB. When we talked a couple of weeks ago about letting different boards and commissions get to meeting, one of the topics came up. Well, what about the PCRB? At that point, we said, well, the first thing we want to do is let's get the PCRB fully constituted. And so we've done that. And now, Brian, one of the things we have to talk with the city as a whole, PCRB has to talk with you in the communications office about how to set up the Zoom meetings and whatever else has to happen so that they can begin to meet. This is something that clearly the community wants very much to get started on, and we've wanted to get started on it. One of the discussions that came, and so we finally filled out the board and they'll be ready to go. One of the discussions that came up repeatedly and has come up repeatedly over the months is the question of whether whether the City Council should revisit the PCRB bylaws that were adopted, and the bylaws that were adopted in December before I took office, and before, for that matter, before Councilor Payne, Councilor McGill took office. That earlier council adopted a set of bylaws that, in their view and in the view of City Attorney John Blair, went about as far as Virginia law allows the PCRB to go. The draft submitted by the initial CRB, as it was called, was asking for some powers that City Attorney Blair does not feel are permitted under Virginia law, and so council adopted a somewhat more muted version of some of those bylaws. And there are still some people who want a more aggressive set of bylaws. Our feeling, I'll tell you, my own personal feeling and the feeling of a number of the other councilors was, number one, let's just get it started. Charlottesville has a history of making the perfect be the enemy of the good. We are always trying to continue to litigate and fuss about decisions that have already been made, rather than simply going ahead and letting those decisions get implemented, and then let's see what happens. And so our overall feeling about it is not that we don't like what the PCRB is going to be doing. Let's get them started and see how it goes. And so that's what we're going to be doing. That was the first thing. The second thing that we did.
Yeah, Mr. Snook, let me just ask you a follow-up question on that.
Yeah.
I mean, you followed this closely as a candidate. You know, how does the PCRB fit into the city's approach to police accountability and racial justice? I mean, just big picture, your perspective on how that fits in, and what kind of a puzzle piece is that as the city moves forward after 2017?
Well, the city has a number of puzzle pieces that are working in the field of diversity, equity, inclusion, racial justice. We've got a human rights Charlene Green recently left the position, the Human Rights Commission. That position's got to be filled again. There's some people who feel that the Human Rights Commission has been ineffective, that council hamstrung it from the beginning. Again, that's an issue in part of the limitations of state law and people wanting us to be able to do more things through this commission than we can do. So that's piece number one. It's been in place for a while, but it's going to have to get sort of refigured as the office gets repopulated. There is an effort, it would be included in the upcoming budget, the budget that we just adopted, for a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There is an ongoing debate there about whether that person ought to be a deputy city manager, whether that person ought to be a director working under the city manager. There are some organizational issues there that we have to confront. There are a number of other places within the police department, for example, and I don't remember, maybe Chief Brackney can help me here, what the current state of things is as far as whether, I know 6 months ago there was talk of hiring somebody within the police department who would be sort of a Fourth Amendment specialist to help with some of these issues. Chief Brackney, what wound up happening with that?
So thank you. Yes, so one of the positions that I created was particularly a person who had a background in legally in Fourth Amendment, and how might they look at our police reports and our investigative detentions and encounters to see if there were patterns and practices that were evolving. We did a first round of interviews in which we had the city attorney, the Commonwealth's attorney, and also we also had the Public Defender's Office sit on those panels to do interviews. And we could not, when we finished with the interviews, come to an offer for an individual who we thought was the right individual. As a matter of fact, the person that we engaged and wanted to be our Fourth Amendment analyst actually went to work for the Public Defender's Office. And that's how qualified of a candidate that they were. There was somebody we were genuinely interested in. We've had to put all hiring on hold since this COVID-19, and that was at the direction of the city managers and everyone else because of COVID-19. And we will revisit exactly that. The job description was put together for us with assistance from the Commonwealth's attorneys, the city attorneys, and our Public Defender's Office, so that we could have the right candidate to do that. So we are still going to hire for that position to make sure that the things that we are doing right are the things that make sense. And don't forget, we've also engaged with the Center for Policing Equity. Long before there was a call to, or the bylaws were passed, or even the forming of a genuine, the authorization of a civilian review board, to look specifically at Charlottesville for what were our patterns and practices, and were we doing things either through policy or behaviors that we were encountering our minority communities at a disproportionate rate than those other individuals. And also to meet with that end, As you know, I post every investigative detention that we have and encounter, and have done so since October of 2018, to include the legal outcomes of those, the race and gender of our officers, and the race and gender of the persons that we engaged in.
Yep.
So we are still
sometimes we
continuing.
measure the emails we don't receive, and we don't receive a lot of emails right now about needing police data.
That
because
is correct.
The department's been putting out a lot of data, and you can find that at police.charlottesville.gov.
Thank you.
If there's somebody in the audience who's listening who would like to ask a question, you can click the raise your hand icon. We'll bring you into the conversation, or you can type a question in the Q&A module. And we do have one person who's raised her hand, and it's Kate Fraley. Kate, you're on with Lloyd, Snook, and Chief Brackney. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for holding these. I want to say thank you first to Chief Brackney about your statements and your support of civilian participation in showing things that are wrong. So I didn't see police at Saturday's event, and it was so nice not to have what we had in 2017. So I appreciate that very much. I wanted to follow up on a couple of things in connection with the Police Civilian Review Board. You said in your statement that you supported the 21st century policing suggestions, or that document, and I wanted to just focus on do I have a limited amount of time?
As do we all.
City Council, do I have to hurry up?
The show ends in a half an hour, Kate.
All right. Well, anyway, there are the pillars. I'm holding them in my hand. This 21st century policing document. There are 6 pillars.
That's correct.
And I think the Police Civilian Review Board has a lot to do with a number of them, and I will in the future be more specific about potentially all of them. But I want to focus on pillar 2.
Policy and oversight?
Yeah. And then down the row, there are 2 incidents involving suspect death or officer involved shooting should be subject to both external and internal oversight. These oversight mechanisms include but are not limited to external review boards, serious incident review boards, and independent investigation. I want to speak to Councilman Snook's comments that the problem with the original bylaws had to do with state law, but the Civilian Review Board bylaws drafters ran those bylaws through the Civilian Review Board in Fairfax. So if they could have done those things, then we should have been able to do them. And specifically, one of the problems in the old bylaws, the current bylaws, is that the only review that the Police Civilian Review Board does are, I'll say it the other way. Those Police Civilian Review Board does not get to review sustained complaints. So in the case of George Floyd, the person who did that had repeated complaints, and we don't know whether they were valid or not, whether they were found to be, I don't know the language, sustained or not. But it would be good for the Police Civilian Review Board to know about and be able to understand all of the complaints and the results of the complaints, not just not excluding the ones that were founded.
Thank you, Kate.
That's number 1 in the...
Yeah, let's let Chief Brackney respond to that.
Oh, okay.
So thank you. So the way that and I was very engaged and active with the Fairfax group as well, and they only have review power as well if there is a complaint that is then sent to them for review or recommended for review. And I won't get into all the logistics and the legality of that. I stand by what the city attorney says is the power and authority. However, Kate, what we have said and what I have committed to is at least having the history of the officers as part of the review, so that even though it may not be relevant to this case, there should be a history attached with the allegations as well as the outcomes, whether that was sustained, unfounded, exonerated, or not resolved, any of those that are there. And that does allow a full and robust evaluation of a current incident in which an officer is involved in. I have been very vocal that I support that. And I have been very vocal about how we engage in genuine, authentic, fair, and impartial oversight of not only Charlottesville's policing agencies, but across the board, to the extent that I have a relationship with NACOL and the president's, and that is the national oversight body that pulls the rest of the about 200 or so civilian oversight bodies throughout the United States together, so that we get it right here in Charlottesville. And we may not get it perfect, but that first swipe at it to make sure that we have systems in place that cannot be dismantled, no matter who sits in my seat or in council seats or in any of the other member seats as well.
And could I add one? This is one of the concerns that I had when I looked at, when I was being asked to revisit all of this, and council, as I chose not to. This is one of the concerns that I had. I think it's a legitimate concern that it may well turn out that in the implementation, and we'll find out as we implement it, we'll find out how it works. It may turn out that we're not able to get some things that the Civilian Review Board ought by all rights to get. And there may be some interpretations of state law and state personnel policy law in particular that preclude that. One of the discussions that we were having, one I had with the City Attorney John Blair, was there may be some tweaks that we need to get our legislators to make to state law to allow some of this information to be disclosed. And how that's going to work is, and what amendments might need to be made, is largely going to be a function of how this PCRB is able to move forward. And if it's running into roadblocks that are created by state law, that's something we need to be able to tell our legislators about. But it needs to be something other than theoretical. And at this point, it's sort of a hypothetical question. We don't know exactly how this is going to get interpreted in practice. But it's part of my goal of let's get the Civilian Review Board up and running, identify the problems, fix the problems. If the problems require cooperation from the state legislature, let's go there. But let's just get it started. Let's get it started.
Mr. Snook, we have another question from a citizen who wants to ask about the statements made by the mayor on Friday. And I know you're not the mayor, but you are a member of City Council, and maybe you could help address his question. So I'm going to invite John Rudder onto the program. And John, your mic is live. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Let's see, Councilor Snook. I don't have the text right in front of me from the mayor's release or statement I saw online, and I fully understand you cannot, and I'm sure would not, speak on her behalf, and she's more than capable of speaking on her own behalf. But from your perspective as a counselor, I don't remember the exact language. I submitted it as a written question to Mr. Wheeler.
If it'll help, I have your email here. I can read to you what it was you were fussing about.
Thank you. If I remember correctly, the essence of it in short was, I felt her use of the phrase, if I'm correct, white America, was unnecessarily inflammatory and divisive. I could say much more, but I'll try to be concise and end there.
I guess my initial response is that the language that she as a black woman would use and the language that I as a white man might use might start from different places, and that's to be expected. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. She is expressing her point of view from her experience, and her experience is very different from mine, and frankly from yours. Your experience and my experience, I suspect, have largely been similar. I think any time that people talk about white America versus black America, you could say on the one hand, gee, you're being divisive. On the other hand, you could say you're being descriptive. And I think it's a matter of being descriptive. The real question to me is not the language that either Mayor Walker or I might use, but rather, what is she describing, and is she describing things accurately? And I think she was describing things accurately. So again, I might not have used exactly the same phrasing, but I agree with the sentiments that she was talking about.
And Mr. Snook, while we have you on camera, why don't we go ahead and finish up on the council meeting and the budget activity that took place. Then we're going to come back to Chief Brackney and talk about our local policing efforts.
Okay, so the other thing we talked about last night, we had the budget on the consent agenda, which people might think, gee, that's pretty odd. The single most important thing that you're going to do this year is on the consent agenda rather than having a great deal of discussion. Well, the fact is, for one thing, we had about 4 months of discussion, at least 2 months of which wound up getting thrown out the window with the coronavirus and having to refigure everything in the middle of March. But we also had a more robust discussion 2 weeks ago. There were really very few things in the budget that wound up being particularly controversial. And let me say, as a general proposition, I have tried to suggest to the city staff and to the city council that the budget season is not the time to have major policy decisions. We should be having those policy discussions in August, September, October, so that when we get to the time of preparing the budget, we are implementing the things that we have discussed in more detail with more specifics earlier on. So some people might say, well, you ducked a lot of hard issues. For example, there were some people who wanted us specifically to get into the nitty-gritty of the police budget and to suggest cuts to the police budget so that money might then be used for something else. We weren't going to do that. This is not the time, the place to do that. That's a discussion that needs to be had, perhaps, but it doesn't need to be had when we've got a deadline for the budget to be submitted. Other issues, for example, we were in the process in March of trying to allocate about $2 million for what we call vibrant community funds. And those are the monies that we give to usually to nonprofits, or in some cases like Thomas Jefferson Health District, to implement things that the city doesn't actually implement. For example, there's some housing programs, some health programs, legal aid assistance programs that we have historically given money to. We were about to do that when it became, number one, clear the governor was shutting down the economy to a large extent. Number two, that we were going to lose a lot of tax revenues, and the tax revenues were suddenly going to become a major problem for the upcoming fiscal year. And so that spending was put on hold. We are at this point projecting a minimum of about $5.5 to $6 million lost revenues, lost from our previous expectations in terms of meals tax revenues, lodging tax revenues, reduced B-poll taxes, things like that. I personally think that we've got a reserve created by not funding some capital projects. And that reserve is about another $6.6 million. I personally think that if the economy doesn't reopen very soon, that $6.6 million may turn out to be a low estimate, but it's a prudent estimate at this point. And there is other room for cuts to be made if we have to make other cuts. So we've got this budget that is essentially balanced with this large reserve of $6.6 million in case things continue to go bad. And that's And that's, I think, a prudent way to go about it. One of the points we did also pass last night, a tax relief program, and I'm not going to try to get into the weeds about the different programs. We've got about 4 or 5 programs of various forms of tax and rent relief. This was a way of saying it looks like we're not going to use up all of the money that we had already allocated for that purpose. $250,000 we're expecting to be sort of a surplus within that account. And so this is a way of allocating at least some of that money to another kind of rent and tax relief for disabled people and so on who have a greater need because of the COVID virus. So a little bit of additional relief for the people who are frankly at greatest economic disadvantage out of the COVID crisis. So that's probably the major other thing that we talked about last night.
Thank you, Mr. Snook. Thank you for all your work on the budget. It was definitely a difficult time during a pandemic, and your first budget to try to pull this together. I want to make one brief announcement about a tax deadline and a statement I made on the radio last week. And I want to make it clear that the first half of Charlottesville's real estate and personal property taxes are due on Friday, June 19th. The bills mailed out have the correct date, and also next week the city will share some news about how we're going to facilitate in-person payments safely at City Hall. So again, just a public service announcement. Your city tax deadline is Friday, June 19th. More information to come from the city on how you can best pay those bills. Let's come back to Chief Brackney here in the studio. A number of questions are coming in, and I know your inbox is getting lots of questions.
My inbox is, yes.
And the questions here are the same ones you're getting. On Facebook, Cecilia Mills asked if there's an ongoing program to teach police officers how to de-escalate. What can you tell us about de-escalation training?
So de-escalation training, and I don't want us to get caught on buzzwords because that's easy to do and get away from the real issue. But it really came to the forefront in 2014 after the death of Michael Brown, and then under President Obama and the 21st century policing concepts, in which Kay Fraley just mentioned as well. And there's been lots of studies on de-escalation and what does that mean. And there's, for those of you who want to look at some of the materials that we give out to our officers, there are always these tips on de-escalation. And what I've been preaching to our officers, it's not words. It's an integrated process in which we involve people, and it's an integrated response to every single thing that we do. If we use it as a buzzword, as a response to resistance, or as part of our force continuum, then it puts it in a box of thinking that it needs to be part of a force continuum or force diagram. What we tell them is that they cannot achieve de-escalation, and there's a lot of training on this, and they get a lot, and we will be posting on our website as a response a full and robust description of the type of training the officers get around de-escalation, conflict resolution, response to resistance, crisis intervention training, bias-based policing, and all of the other ones that really people are rightfully asking, what are our officers doing about that?
Yes. I mean, a question about another form of de-escalation is not being in the path of people peacefully protesting in Charlottesville.
Right.
So what can you tell us about over this past weekend when a march of 500,000 people is moving up Preston Avenue? What is going through your mind as our chief of police?
So de-escalation is about limiting police interventions to start with, right? The necessity to have to call a policing presence into whatever your environment is. So the first thoughts I had is, how do we do that in a way that continues to keep the community safe? And when I say the community safe, because the protest is about, the demonstration is about, the resistance is about the community not feeling safe at the hands of police. So my first thoughts are, how do I pull back and allow an environment where people can be heard, but also not a repeat of the events that occurred in 2017 when somebody weaponizes a vehicle into a crowd? So how do I do that? And I do that by giving the organizers enough space and limiting our interactions, particularly when they're peaceful. And we've seen across the nation, and I'm ashamed when I'm seeing this and getting these images, and because everybody who knows that I'm in law enforcement sends me every single image of every officer who's doing something that goes against what they stand for, what they've been sworn to do. So my first thoughts and my thoughts are always going to be, how do we limit those interactions? Because the community has a voice. It does know how to police itself. There are ways, though, we must intervene legally when we think about death and destruction. But I'm always trying to balance, as I say, that community safety, that community health with their wellness and their being. And it is a really tough balancing act. And a lot of it centers around policies. What are our body-worn camera policies? I'm sure you're getting those.
That's the next question. And John McLaren, I know you've raised your hand and you've typed a question in the Q&A module. Let's bring you into the program. John, you had a question about body-worn cameras. Go ahead.
Sure. I'm not really clear on what role they have in our police department. I know in a lot of cities, rules on body cam have been pretty central in governing police-civilian interactions. And is that a big part of our strategy here?
Thank you for that, John. What we tell everybody is yes, yes, and yes. One of the things that I have really pushed is police legitimacy and transparency, and the way that you do that is you have to take the cover off your policies. We now post every policy that we have on our website, and we've been doing that since January of this year, to include our body-worn cameras under mobile recording systems. The Charlottesville Police Department has had body-worn cameras and has participated very robustly in that since 2018. All of our officers are issued body-worn cameras, including our CSOs, or community service officers, who are not sworn personnel but also interact with the public. The rules about how they must have them on are detailed in our policy that is also on the website, as well as our mobile recording devices that are in the vehicles. And when they must be activated, and how they are activated. So we have a very strong, robust program that we have not backed away from, even though there are a lot of agencies who are backing away from body-worn cameras because of the cost associated with them. And that can be up to, in a very small agency, or not, a medium-sized agency like Charlottesville, well over $250,000 a year that we dedicate to just the storage and retention systems, and not necessarily even the equipment. And we've committed to that, and we will not defund our body-worn camera programs, because it does increase, one, our accountability. It also allows for transparency. And it then says to the community that we are going to live up to the values and expectations of how the community should and wants to be policed.
Our next question, and we've got about 4 minutes left on the program, is from Tanisha Hudson. Tanisha, you're on. What's your question for Chief Brackney?
My question is, what are you putting in place when cops are violating these body-worn camera policies that you say you have in place? Because it's been violated on more than one occasion here recently since you've accepted your tenure as a police chief. So what are you being transparent with the community about when they're not wearing these cameras, when issues are coming about in the community? And what are you doing in reference to the complaint process when residents feel like you guys aren't being transparent and open about that? Because there's been a lot of complaints, and you know this, that residents have put in with certain neighborhoods, with aggressive policing, with tactics that have been used by the department, some before you got here, some since you've been here, and things are still not being done. So what are you doing, or what would you suggest that we do on the outside to really make this thing work right?
Chief Brackney?
So thank you. So since when I arrived here in June of 2018, one of the legitimate questions and complaints that came out of the community was that when complaints went into internal affairs, that it was a black hole. At that point, then I had to go back and look at what that complaint was, and there was absolute legitimacy to it. I started a accountability and as well as a auditing process for our complaints. As you now can see, if you go on our website, we post now every complaint when it came in, when it was closed, the type of complaint that it was, as well as the outcome. And if you look on our website right now, you'll even see where we have collateral findings that the initial complaint may have come in that the officer was rude or discourteous, and then you'll see an additional complaint, internal one, of that we found the officer did not have their body-worn camera on. And that's actually some of the complaints are posted on our website. Look at it. You'll see a body-worn camera complaint in which we sustained an individual for failing to adhere to our policies. So we post those on those sites. Unfortunately, the community always wants to know from me, well, what did you do to that officer? What was the discipline? What was the retraining? What was the counseling? Our personnel records do not allow us to reveal what type of discipline they may have received, what type of outcome was an outgrowth of their complaints. So we are extremely transparent about those type of violations. And if you look on our website, you will see a lot of sustained complaints against our officers that have resulted. I mean, you don't see the end result of it, but no, the options include counseling, retraining, demotions, terminations, and a variety of other suspensions, loss of leave, a variety of other things that we put in place, including employee improvement plans that result in their termination if they do not fulfill those plans and meet the expectations of the department.
Chief, I want to finish, just maybe reflect a little bit on the statement you collaborated on with Dr. Richardson and the mayor last Friday. Before the weekend even started, you wanted to make a strong statement about the killing of George Floyd. And any other reflections you want to share right now?
So yes, you're absolutely right. Wanted to make a strong statement from the beginning, and as you know, we thought very intentionally about when the timing and the releasing of that statement should go out. As you know, originally, and Mayor Walker said yesterday, I was putting a statement out. I was putting a statement out regardless of, my national counterparts or other individuals. And it was important to make that statement for a variety of reasons. One, our officers here in Charlottesville understand very clearly what the direction of this department should be, particularly in light of the incidents that occurred in 2017, in which we should and have failed to own a lot of our horrors that we in the law enforcement profession have continued to impose upon Black and brown communities. And that I was going to be very clear that I could not stand in silence about that, not only as a Black woman, but as a Black professional who has been in this. I am proud to stand with our mayor in the statements that she made. I am comfortable with the words that she used when she reflected on the majority of the community across America, which is a white majority, whether we want to accept that or not. And I am continuing to be proud to serve here in Charlottesville. And if the community does and still has, as they're bombarding my email now, have concerns, I would ask that they bring those concerns not when it's convenient or when they think that there's a national movement, but the everyday hold us accountable, not when there's just national spotlight. Yeah. And I'm comfortable with that accountability and transparency.
Thank you. I think the everyday activities that you and even Chief Baxter and the fire department, all those public safety things we're doing every day are paying off in this community. So thank you for your work.
And thank you for the community as well.
Yep. So our next show will be on Tuesday, June 9th in 1 week. Please contact me with feedback and ideas about future topics and guests. Thank you for watching. This has been a great discussion today. and please stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.